Hello, welcome to my podcast and my YouTube channel. Today, my guest is Tamara Webb. I met Tamara, what was it, a year ago, a year and a half?
I'm not sure. It's been a while. Yeah.
Back then, when I could do my interviews in person. Now we are
Pre-COVID.
here stuck at home because of COVID. She is a licensed counselor and she works here in Portland, Oregon. She's specialized in grief and trauma, and she presents herself as holistic and wellness minded therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start with that. Thank you so much for being with us, Tamara. But I would like for you to start explaining what holistic means.
Oh, you know, so often, especially in Western medicine, we're getting treatment that's really kind of a fraction of something. I think of I'm going to go to the doctor, and there's something wrong with my finger, and they're going to tell me, "Oh, sorry, I don't do that finger. I only do these other fingers." You know, so excuse me, um, just so piecemeal.
Mhm.
And really, mental health in particular, physical health, they're so woven together that we really have to see our clients, I believe, in the most holistic frame possible. Uh, Physical health, energy level, cognitive functioning, and then the nature and quality of the state of mind, and the spiritual aspects of a person. And I don't mean that from any sort of religious dogma. I'm not a Christian counselor or anything of that sort. But spirituality is important to people. So I think when we are able to kind of try to look at the whole of the client that way, and then within the context of their environment, that we begin to see a bigger picture. And very often, sadly, psychotherapists are usually the practitioner, the health oriented practitioner, who spends the most amount of time with their patients or clients. So we actually have that opportunity to investigate and ask questions about all these different domains of life. And it can be incredibly informative to the direction that our treatment takes, and also a person just feeling like they're being seen for who they really are.
Mhm. Well, can you walk us through, let's say I'm a patient and I come to you, what kind of questions would you ask? Just so you can explore all this, the holistic um,
Sure.
patient.
So when I start any initial session with a client, I do a full assessment in the first course of at the beginning of the course of treatment,
Mhm.
and that would be, telling me a little bit about why now you want to start therapy, what's going on, and then I'll be asking questions about everything from how their body feels, the muscles, the digestion, their level of activity, what they're doing with their time, even when they're looking at screens. What are they doing? Are they watching a lot of news? Are they scrolling social media? Are they doing a lot of gaming? Are they watching movies all the time? Listening to podcasts? That kind of sense of what's the person intaking in many ways, not just,
Mm.
and so there'll be also questions about the history of the health conditions, um, especially for women, the different stages where they are in terms of their reproductive life, if um, health and hormone issues and things like that, that we know kind of affect our mood states. Really having a lot of questions about that with people,
Mhm.
including like even like what kind of birth control are you on?
Uh-huh. What about spirituality? You mentioned that too.
So spirituality, that's a question of, like, for starters, do you have a spiritual orientation that matters to you? Is there something important? What are your traditions? What are your rituals? What are your practices? Um, our sense of whether or not we have a feeling of connection to something larger than ourselves, or a sense of mystery and awe tends to be a factor in a person's sense of well-being. It's core to the existential crises that people experience, especially in the wake of loss.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritual questions become quite germane. There's some people see the collapse of spiritual belief systems in the wake of loss, and some people see the birth of them. So
Mm.
I'll ask a lot of questions about that.
Yes, and when you talked about the spiritual side too, that's what came to mind. I mean, when you go through grief, that can be so healing, can't
Mm-hmm.
it? Yeah. Let's talk about, in Tamara, I'm so glad I'm talking to you because as you said, it's not very common. And I know that when I was researching for my book, it was hard for me to find therapists that dealt in a more holistic way, that dealt with the body, with food, with exercise, and
Mm-hmm.
not just talk therapy. So I'm really glad that you said yes to this interview because also we can teach or educate my audience in terms of, okay, if you don't go through a therapist, there are so many ways that you can pay attention to that will have a direct impact on your mental health. So let's
Mm-hmm.
start with food.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when we talk about, oh, take care of yourself, when we talk about food, we only think about the body in terms of body weight. And we know
Oh,
now that it's, you mentioned in the beginning that these things are, everything's connected, and it is. This dichotomy of body, remember when you used to talk about your mind and body and your brain, everything separated? No, we know that that's not true, but we have way more information now about for example, the impact of food on your mental
oh
health.
my,
So
yeah.
can you educate my audience on that? Why should you pay attention to what you eat?
Because inadequate nutrition makes you feel terrible. And, and by inadequate nutrition, that's both starvation and poverty of nutrients. So you can be eating a lot of food, getting adequate calories, but the quality of those calories, if they're coming from, junk food, for example, or if there's not sufficient protein in the diet or sufficient fats in the diet, like quite literally, this feeds the brain. The most powerful thing that we do, in terms of any kind of medical treatment is it starts at that basic core of what do we eat. It's Hippocrates. I think all illness begins in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
Health begins in the gut too. So this big kind of, it's not just the microbiome. It's this idea of these nutrients literally need to get up here. So I see a lot of clients, for example, who will have, especially in the wake of loss, trauma, lose their appetite. And the loss of appetite, it's, I totally get it. I've lost my appetite plenty of times over something that was really distressing. There's an element where you have to take a kind of bit of personal responsibility if you can and overwhelm that loss of appetite, even eating something really simple like scrambled eggs, because you need that combination of protein and cholesterol for your brain to function decently.
Mm-hmm.
So, I ask a lot of questions about what people are eating when it starts to become, relevant. I have one client right now, for example, who, oh, does she have bipolar disorder? Does she have borderline personality disorder? Does she have, and, these different medical, practitioners kind of batting her back and forth with these diagnoses. And then I'm talking to her one day and I'm like, well, what have you eaten? She's like, oh, I hardly ever eat. I'm like, really?
Wow.
Is it because of, are you worried about weight gain or something? She's like, no. And I don't know what the big deal is. And I'm like, well, you keep going to the hospital with these suicide attempts, and there's a whole foundation here of basic nutrition that you want to start with, as opposed to lithium. If you can avoid a heavy psychiatric drug, by learning how to feed yourself properly, wouldn't that be the best possible outcome?
hmm You mentioned gut, and what came to my mind was that this is very popular now. We talk about neurotransmitters and brain, and we associate it with the brain all the time. But we know that a lot of the neurotransmitters, serotonin, a lot of it, most of serotonin, they're actually produced in your gut. So and it's just mind blowing because I remember when I read it the first time. So what? I had no idea. So this is how relevant food is, right?
Yeah. And it also speaks to uh, kind of a substantial miseducation of a lot of people with regard to psychiatric medications and the thought that it's adjusting a brain chemistry. I think it would be
Oh,
better
yes, I hadn't
to
thought of
say
that.
it's
Yes.
adjusting body chemistry. Like
Mm-hmm.
let's stop talking about brain chemistry and think
Mm-hmm.
of the whole thing here.
Mm-hmm. So if they ask you what should I eat, what would you say? What would be good for my brain or for my body or for my mental health?
Well, I'm not an expert in nutrition, right? But I would say that following as a balance of a diet with whole foods as much as possible, preparing what you can at home yourself will bring you the healthiest food typically. But starting with the basics. With a lot of people with loss of appetite, I really do recommend it's like get some eggs into you.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very easy to digest compared to other forms of food. I mean, it's, as long as you're not allergic to them,
Mm-hmm.
and very rapidly uptake by the body. And protein and
Mm-hmm.
cholesterol, things that you
Mm-hmm.
actually, cholesterol is not a bad thing.
No, the healthy fat, right? Because
Yeah,
also
yeah.
the brain,
Avocado.
yeah, most of your brain is fat, and it
Exactly,
doesn't produce fat, so you have to make sure it gets from somewhere,
exactly.
right?
Olive oil. I mean, I think the Mediterranean diet for
It's
a lot of,
perfect, yeah.
yeah,
It's the best one. All research shows that when you're talking about the brain and brain health, Mediterranean diet is the best.
yeah, olive oil, nuts, and that's the other thing is like, if somebody's like really depressed or really grieving and they're not going to prepare their food, a handful of almonds goes a long way, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like
Mm-hmm.
something simple like that, but of course, produce, fresh vegetables, uh, anything that you grow in your garden is, typically better than you even find at the grocery store. So, you know, get
Mm-hmm.
out there and grow your own food and you'll really have better mental health.
Yeah. What about exercise? Is that important and why?
Well, I kind of think about, in this kind of old style thinking of, I'm, way in the past, the humors. You got to stir up your humors a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Exercise is crucial for like literally circulating everything in the body, expressing toxins through sweat, you know, just the movement of the joints. Crying itself is a form of exercise. It's got a deep breathing pattern to it. It's got this kind of constricting and movement of the intercostal muscles, the pectoral muscles, the traps, the lats. Like crying is like a good full body upper torso exercise. If you're sad, go for it. And the tears excrete stress hormones. So if you just crying can be a form of exercise. I'm sorry. But getting out in a walk, being outside in nature, dancing, movement that like, helps you come up out of, your head, uh, you
Mm-hmm.
know, up out of your head or down into your body. Either way, you
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily get stuck in all of your messy thoughts when you're doing something physical.
Mm-hmm. What is the reaction that your clients have when you start talking about food and exercise in your body and taking care of that? How do they take it?
A lot of them actually, will come to me because they've seen that I'm looking at stuff through a holistic frame, and so they're open to that. They're curious about that. Others, like the client I was just talking about, who's not eating, she had no idea. She just found me in her insurance companies list of in-network providers. And so she wasn't quite as open to the idea. So then I start actually providing psychoeducation around it to them, especially, it's a really dialogic process. So I'm listening to what people are saying and then offering these kind of responses more than typically giving a little lecture about the whys and the wherefores of proper nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Tamara, what brings your clients to therapy? And I'm talking about grief.
Well, I would say that one primary thing, sadly, that brings people to therapy for grief is loneliness. Is feeling like they don't have
Wow.
people to talk to. Is feeling like people have lost their patience with this person still experiencing grief. And
Mm,
those timelines can be very short, people's expectations about how long it takes to get over something.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, the
then,
famous get over it, right?
oh, I hate it. I hate it. Um, and then another substantial thing that brings people to my practice is a complicated or traumatic loss. So the death is something that is really bothersome. Death by suicide, death by homicide, natural disasters. Here you have COVID deaths. I haven't started treating COVID deaths, but I can imagine
Oh
that
my
that's coming.
God.
You know, Feeling like they just have a lot of stuff that feels unresolved and feel like the advice or responses that they're getting from the people around them, if they have people around them, are not helping them move down the path to feeling better.
Mm-hmm. You talked about complicated grief.
Mm-hmm.
What is complicated grief? I mean, how can you, because I believe that most of the times when clients come to you for grief, they think that there is something wrong with the way they're grieving,
Oh.
right? That happens a lot.
Mm.
I had a patient that was last year, and the reason why, and I thought that was so moving, the reason why he came to therapy was because he said he couldn't feel anymore. And he
Mm.
knew that it was because of a lot of losses that he'd had, lost his father, sister, best friend within 2 years. And it
Mm-hmm.
was just too much.
Mm-hmm.
So, how can they know, someone who is listening to us, how can they know? And I don't want to say unhealthy grief, but there is this concept of complicated grief. And I want
Mm-hmm.
for my audience to understand what that is, and maybe how can they identify that maybe it's time that they look into it and explore it
Mm-hmm.
better.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's not a timeline, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of different cultural views about how grief is to be expressed. Like there's a lot of different cultural rules about
Mm-hmm.
that, um, uh, internationally. So I can't make a sweeping statement about when is somebody's grief problematic. Like, oh, it's this long, then
Mm-hmm.
it's a problem. But I think if you're looking at 6 months or so that you've been having persistent grief and it's feeling prolonged in a way, like you're crying intensely all the time, or you're having just fixation, your mind is fixated on the person or the job or the pet or whatever the source of loss is, whatever you're grieving. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that it's the idea of I cannot go through the life and future without this person, or I can't live with the memories that I'm having about the way in which they died, or the thoughts that I'm having about what happened at the time of death or preceding the death. I don't feel like I had the conversations that I needed to have with this person, and I'm really torn up about that. And I can't seem to find a way to bring peace to my heart about any of that. Um, so there's a matter of duration there's a matter of persistence, and there's a matter of intensity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of us, usually when we lose somebody, we're like, oh, we'll tend to say this grief feels intense to me in some fashion,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's not this, what is the marker of intensity? Well, I would say that if it feels problematic to you, if it feels like um, you, if you feel like you cannot get away from your grief, cannot take a break from it, it's overwhelming you.
You can't
Uh,
function. Yeah.
if it's impairing your ability to do your job, your ability to carry out the activities of daily living, if other people in your life are saying the manner in which you're grieving is affecting our relationship
Mm.
in a really negative way, you know, and that's not to say that that's always complex. Sometimes that's that person's problem and
Mm-hmm.
not yours as the person who's grieving. But if you think about a psychiatric diagnoses in the DSM, there's these domains that have to do with, if you're getting in legal trouble because of this problem, if you're losing your job, if your
Mm-hmm.
relationships, that kind of thing tends to stand out of like, and then your own personal sense of discomfort around it. And if you feel like you need somebody to help you with it, don't waste time. Ask someone for help.
Mm-hmm. What about suicide? I know that you've had a lot of patients who came to you for suicide grief. And I'd like to know if there is any difference. What is distinctive about suicide grief?
The number one thing that comes to mind for me right off the bat is the self blame, the regrets, I should have done something,
Mm-hmm.
stories that we have that are not typical of somebody, you know, they had cancer and maybe we're like, oh, I should have gone and seen this person, but a sense of like that we had some ability or need
Mm-hmm.
stop or change that outcome of the suicide is different, tends to be different than a lot of the other ways in which people die, and
Mm-hmm.
feelings of guilt. Um, and I would say that there's a level of persistence, of people feeling like this is so much harder to put down. Like I don't understand why they did this. I don't, or they left me this letter and I don't understand this letter even, or it's really upsetting what they said to me in this letter.
Mm.
A lot of other forms of death don't come with letters,
Yes.
or there's no letter, there's no explanation,
Which
and there's no
sometimes it's even
story.
worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that a few times. People say, why didn't they leave a letter? Because we have this idea that in suicide people leave, and it's actually very rare.
Yeah, it's not
That's
that
what
common.
that's what research shows. What about the impact on families? I was talking to someone the other
Mm,
day, and he lost his daughter to suicide, and he was the last person to see her. They had lunch, and that afternoon she took her life. And
mm,
he was telling me that his ex-wife and his two other kids, they all blame him for that. How could you not see it? And not even
mm.
that, but things like, what did you tell her? What did you tell her that maybe made her
Oh
do
no,
that?
blame.
So scapegoating, and we know that that happens. So that the family picks one person to be the guilty party. Maybe someone who didn't have a good relationship, and they don't have time to repair anymore. But how do you see that impacting families?
What I often notice is that whatever the family dynamic was, whatever the family dysfunction was in particular, it starts to get magnified.
I see.
It starts to get more exaggerated. And uh, rarely does it seem to bring about a feeling of bringing everyone together and healing over something. There does tend to be a lot of blame. Gosh, I just had a family friend, my partner's commit suicide back, oh, was it this year or was it last? Time is getting very
Mhm.
distorted in this pandemic. It feels really
I
recent.
know. We totally lost track of time and even the idea of what time is supposed to be
Yeah.
like.
Oh, actually, it was Valentine's, and it was here. Yeah, it's Valentine's, just this past Valentine's Day, and uh, he had some children, and then some other members of the family, and then this is within my family circle, hearing other relatives creating stories and blaming the wife of the man who killed himself,
Mm-hmm.
and I just that's a really complicated dynamic, because you're talking about some of the stuff that we need in the wake of trauma, and suicide is a trauma for people who survive it. We need compassion, and we need healing stories, not divisive ones. And people, when they're frustrated and they're confused and they're angry and shocked,
Mm-hmm.
we are all story makers, like persistently, about everything in our lives, even just the interactions we might have at the grocery store or the coffee counter with a person who is providing service to us.
Mm-hmm.
We make up stories about what's going on with them and why their attitude feels like it is, for better or worse, on that particular day. It's this person we don't even know. So, around something like suicide, um, man, the stories, they just start flying.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's like often tends to be like this extra layer of wounding that goes on. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that said, there are some families that, handle it much better.
Yeah, and when let's say you have a patient who comes to you and the family is blaming him on her or her, and you're not treating the family, you're just treating this individual. So what can they do about that? How can they approach that with their families?
Mm. Um, wow, that's a big, nice blanket question, Paul. It's a big one, because it's so idiosyncratic too. I mean, you've got a family constellation. It depends on what this person's role and position in the family is, but you're saying here they are the scapegoat of this story. I think first and foremost, um, you have to work through yourself, um, the understanding of what that blame is about. And the first step for me, with a lot of patients, is learning some self-compassion,
Mm-hmm.
because it is very easy to hear the stories that other people tell us, and encounter our own internal senses of uncertainty, or even feeling like, perhaps this guy that you were just talking about felt like maybe he did say something. And what do you do with that, right? Is really a matter of um, kind of picking apart the narrative that we have with ourselves first, and then deciding where we stand. And then with the family, being able to say, I understand you're hurt. I'm hurt too. I understand your sorrow, and I'm sad too in some way. This extra layer where we make up stories, or we just decide on things, and we're speaking on behalf of somebody who is not here anymore and maybe has left all of us feeling mystified about this choice. Is it really honoring their memory
Mm-hmm.
to just spread whatever sense of blame you might have far and wide? So I would ask clients, if they really wanted to interact with their family in that way, to kind of develop an idea in session about what it is that they want to say, and then figure out the manner in which the family can receive it. Because sometimes you could have an effective conversation. Sometimes it's also more effective to sit down and write something that other people can read and take their time to digest, and hope that they will have a more measured response after reading it instead of maybe the heat of the moment sort of thing.
Yes, and you're talking about stories and internalizing. In his case, we talked a lot about this, and you sometimes internalize the guilt that people put on you.
Mm-hmm.
And he would say, and I've been over and over and over our conversation, because he started to believe that maybe he did say something. And it's the opposite. They were making plans. I think they were going to a party, or maybe it was a trip, and they spent the whole lunch, last time they saw each other, planning for that.
Ooh.
So, and it's one of those stories. He said, Paula, there was no sign. She was making plans with me.
Yeah, that is really
But you do
radical.
inter and you ha- and you do have to be careful with that, because blaming, when once you internalize it, you believe it, and that makes healing so much harder, doesn't
Oh,
it?
yeah, it does. It's not even just that it makes healing harder, it's that it adds trauma to the loss.
Oh, yes.
Trauma on top of trauma, you know.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk about shame? Because
Mm,
I believe that in suicide, shame is a big word, and many times it's in the center of grief. And and sometimes I hear people, and I'm sure you've heard this too, but people say, well, I don't talk because people don't want to listen. But
mm,
sometimes you see families that they don't talk because they're ashamed of what happened, and they
mhm,
don't want to be questioned. They don't want
mhm,
people pointing fingers at them.
mhm,
So,
mhm.
what would you say to someone who says, well, I can't talk about it because I'm ashamed of what happened? Because it's kind of related to guilt, too, isn't it?
Mm, mm. I would imagine in the connection of guilt and shame that you're talking about, this sense of like, if we are questioning something ourselves and we're feeling uncertain about why someone close to us killed themselves, it's really easy to project onto other people that they're going to be wondering the same thing,
Mm,
about us. Like, what did we do? Or why weren't we able to stop this person? Or what, the whole blame and shame and guilt shit show is
mm-hmm.
what I want to call it.
Yeah, yeah.
um, but I think that, there's also just a lot of cultural issues around suicide. I know that
Mm,
when I was working as a journalist, by and large, we did not ever report on suicides unless they became so visible to the community that it was impossible to not see it.
to
Like the
ignore
people,
it. Yeah.
yeah, those people that hung themselves from the steel bridge a few decades
Mhm.
ago,
Or if
in
it's a
the
celebrity, right? Or if it's
a
someone,
celebrity, Robin
yeah.
Williams, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, so since there's that cultural sense that this is not an honorable death in some way,
Mm,
then maybe that inclination is there to hide it. But it all comes back, I think, for a lot of people of, worrying about how others are going to see the family, or are going to wonder what were you doing with that? If that was your boyfriend or your spouse, who killed themselves, there's just so many things that we project onto the minds of others
mm-hmm.
about what they might think of us or the relationship that we had. And
Mm-hmm.
most people, especially in light of grief, don't want to bear additional layers of scrutiny. So there's kind of a shutdown, I think, that occurs for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people.
Mm-hmm. You talked about scrutiny, and I don't remember which book, because I read so much about this topic and grief. But it was the author was just highlighting the differences between grief, other kinds of grief, and suicide. And one of them was, and it just stuck to my mind, that when there is any other kind of death, people respect your privacy and the family privacy. With suicide, it's the opposite. They start asking questions. They're invasive.
Why did this happen? What was going on with them before
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
How did they do that? Did you find them? What? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So it really does make sense. Tamara, you mentioned cultural stigma and shame and all of that. And also in the beginning of the interview, you talked about spirituality. Let's talk about religion. Do you
Hmm.
get a lot of people who come to you because they have certain religion, and we know that suicide for any religion is shameful, right? It's a sin. And there's not one religion that I know that says, okay, let's respect what happened, but there is a lot of shame there. And so, how do you deal with that?
Well, religion, there's a lot of religious dogma, right? That speaks to this idea, especially within like traditions where there is an afterlife, that the person who is died, has committed suicide, is going to be in an unfavorable afterlife, whatever that one might be, in
Mm-hmm.
whatever belief system, that you get punished. Or in terms of even the idea of reincarnation in cultures with reincarnation, that basically your choice around suicide was that you're copped out. You had something that you were supposed to be dealing with in this life, and now you kind of set yourself back, and in the next iteration of your life, you're going to have to deal with whatever this problem is that you ran away from in this life, right? That's kind of two core religious beliefs that I've encountered among clients with family members who've killed and loved ones who've killed themselves. Um, and you know, I would say that there's a lot of people who end up questioning their spiritual belief systems or their religious belief systems, and maybe that is one of the places where people move, in their healing more away from dogma and towards spirituality. You know, then there's that aspect on top of that of what constitutes forgiveness within
Mm.
that religious system. So those are the things that I have worked around. As someone who doesn't hold dogmatic beliefs, I just try and mostly hold the space for people who are processing that sort of um, conflict
Mm-hmm.
between the manner of death and what religion says about it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, and I'll say, this is a great thing to like explore with somebody who is much more steeped in this religion if you're looking for a way that maybe, this is not so bad. Um, it was interesting.
Yeah.
Another
Yeah.
client in Islam, a Muslim client, was talking about um, uh, making suicide attempts as a consequence of being a sexual minority. And finally, one of her friends said to her, isn't there a rule in Islam that says that if something was so bad that you would actually kill yourself over it, then why don't you just be with the thing that's so bad, as opposed to, like sexual identity, sexual orientation.
Mm-hmm.
It's better to be gay than commit suicide. So there's that whole element of how people, try to navigate the conflicting realities of being a human being trying to live a spiritual or religious life,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and then feeling confronted by that and the demoralized sense of self that sometimes draws people towards suicide.
No, I didn't have any bad experience in terms of religion, but my sister did.
Mm,
I think it was very recent, maybe 2 weeks after my father took his life. Someone asked her what happened. They heard about my father's death and they asked what happened. And she said, well, it was suicide. Because in my family, we always said we never had any shame in terms of what happened. So she said, yeah, it was suicide. And they said, wow, your father is in a horrible place right now. And they started describing this place. There is a name for it. I don't even know. But can you imagine?
It's rude.
You think it's not bad enough that I lost my father and you have to tell me where he is according to your beliefs?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
That's pretty
it's,
wretched. That's
yeah,
so
it's
sad.
really hard. And I remember she told us she was just baffled that someone would say that. But it does happen, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tamara, I want to end our interview pretending to be a client. Let's say I come to you and I have 4 topics to explore. Let's say I come to you, I lost someone to suicide, a loved one, and I come to you and I think I'm guilty. It's my
Mm,
fault
mm,
for whatever reason. It can be because I wasn't a good father, or I wasn't a good partner, or maybe I
mm,
didn't pay attention, maybe I didn't believe. We see this in parents, right? I mean, how
mm,
could I, as a parent, I didn't see this happening, and I'm supposed to protect them. But this kind,
mm,
and I'm not saying the kind of guilt that maybe has some kind of touch with reality, let's say abuse or something like that. I'm just saying that I feel guilty because I didn't see it, because I didn't help enough,
mm,
or I wasn't present. So
mm,
what would you say to someone who comes to you saying that?
mm. You know, um, I think one of the things that we tend to do is centralize ourselves in just about every story, every experience that occurs in our life. Like right now, we're all in the middle of this pandemic, and many of us will centralize ourselves, even, however, um, we might, maybe if we haven't even known someone yet to get sick with it, we still got a real focus on ourselves. And I think it's very easy to make that leap into the sense of like, I was at the center of this person's life. And that might be true to some degree, but really that person was at the center of their life.
Mm-hmm.
And the choices that are involved in killing oneself. Uh, Sometimes it feels like for the people who are killing themselves that there's not a choice. That's, I would say, probably more often than not, it doesn't feel like a choice when you reach that point in your life. Um, and somebody else, I think many of us actually spend a lot of time with people if we know that somebody is depressed, you know,
Mm-hmm.
or we know that they're really troubled somehow or another, or they're falling into addiction or something. That we do a lot of things to attempt to help bring their awareness to how difficult the situation is and that they need help, right? Or we want them to get help. Sometimes we have that opportunity. Sometimes we see that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, though, we get blindsided by death, period, but specifically suicide. And to imagine that we can go back through the tapestry of everything that has occurred in that person's life, and somehow or another, we're going to find that one little thread. That if we just pull on that one little thread, then they would have never ended up dying in the manner that they did. I don't want to say that's too egotistical,
Mm-hmm.
but ego is a piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
Sense of our own kind of omnipotence. Um, but it's it's that desire that you had to stop this thing from happening is an expression of your love. It's an expression of your compassion, your empathy, your desire to have this person still with you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to be able to shift guilt and look at it through this kind of reflexive lens. This is really just how big and strong is my desire to have not had this experience, not experienced a loss like this,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And I
So
think it's
give a little perspective to
perspective,
broaden. Yeah.
and to also to take the emotion, you know. I mean, that's the thing, is what's guilt, what's shame, you know. I mean, they're
The
reflective of
weight, you know, the
these
weight
emotions.
of this
Yes,
guilt.
yeah,
Because there is
you know,
much to their lives than that, right?
yes, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And and other people, I mean, I never want to make suicide equivalent to cats, but maybe I told
Mm-hmm.
you this when we were talking in my office, but years ago, decades ago, there was a case in the state of California. It got all the way to the Supreme Court about a neighbor with his whose cat went over and scratched up, like, say, a screen door or something. I can't remember the little details, but this cat did some damage to his next door neighbor's house, right? So the person whose house was damaged tried to sue the owner of the cat.
Mm.
And in the outcome of the court, the state of the Supreme Court of California ruled that cats were independent agents. That you can't actually
Unbelievable. It got to
have.
Supreme Court.
If my recollection is correct, I'm pretty sure that this is a story back when I was a journalist, like more than 20 years ago. That a cat is an independent agent,
Mm-hmm.
and a person cannot actually control the behaviors of a cat. And I say to my clients, if someone else cannot control the behaviors of a cat, it is not on you to control the behaviors of another human being. We're sentient
Mm-hmm.
people. We make decisions, we make choices. And sometimes sometimes we're so embroiled in our own mess that we don't see our way out of it, and we make really impulsive, terrible decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those decisions are suicide. And that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But it's not your fault.
Thank you, Tamara. I'm just going to end with one more. I had four, but you answered so well that I think you covered most of them. So the last one is, the last words I told them were harsh. That's
Mm-hmm.
the last, because we know that this is something that happens with grief. You tend to forget a lifetime of relationship, and it's like the last minute or the way they died or the last image you saw, and that's what sticks to you, and it it you become stuck with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a terrible, heartbreaking, devastating experience, and I have never found any words or a perspective or approach that wipes that slate clean for people. You know, what I try to do over the course of working with people is move toward that place again of self-compassion and forgiveness, of a
Mm-hmm.
recognition that we as human beings, in the heat of some moments, you know, especially where very often people who commit suicide have been having um, other difficulties. Maybe there be, you know, there's behavioral issues, or there's substance abuse issues, or there's bipolar mania with all kinds of, you know, devastating consequences, um, that actually legitimately disrupt, frustrate, and anger the people around them. And in those moments of legitimate frustration and anger,
Mm-hmm.
we authentically say, I'm disappointed, I'm upset, I'm angry, you're pissing me off, you know, I never want to see you again, stuff like that, that, you know, feels true in those moments. And that is not typically, to my knowledge, my experience, what has driven people to attempt suicide and to complete suicide. People are typically not putting it all on those last words. You
No,
were
no,
not the
and
straw that broke the
yeah.
camel's back.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because often when I, give teach classes or talk to people about suicide, I always say we tend to see the final result. I mean, the final act of suicide, but there is always a list of things and so many things that happen in their lives. They're in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
There is just this. It's like looking at the sky and you see so many stars, but these are little things. It's like a puzzle, but you have to
Mm-hmm.
look at the whole picture and
The
not
whole
just the
Milky Way.
final act.
Mm-hmm.
So that might help too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that analogy of stars. That difference between here is this,
Hmm.
here's Alpha Centauri,
Yeah,
you know, here's the
yeah.
entire Milky Way.
Yeah,
And that
there is
person,
our life is like a constellation of stars. It's
mm-hmm,
never
mm-hmm,
just one thing because
mm-hmm.
this is so often, and that's what brings shame and guilt to many family members because you always ask why, and then they try, oh, because they got divorced, oh, because they had financial problems, and it's never just one thing.
It's a
That
good
may be the
question.
trigger, and maybe the
Mm-hmm,
trigger and the
mm-hmm,
last drop, or however
mm-hmm,
you want to call it, but look at their lives.
mm-hmm. Sometimes, that's facilitated too by taking a look at your own life and some complicated decision that you made, right? And then maybe taking that apart with the client or the person, yourself, whatever. What do you want to hang your decision on? Exactly what of these features was the reason, the number one and only reason? Oh, so those other things weren't complicated.
Mm.
They didn't factor into this.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you peel things apart like that with people, they can usually begin to see, that constellation is a lot bigger than that one little star out there.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And when we talked about the last things I said were harsh or I was rude to
mm-hmm,
them, or same thing, look back at your relationship. Your relationship was not defined by that last moment.
that's right. That's right.
So,
Yeah.
well,
Mm,
thank you, Tamara, again.
mm,
Thank you
mm.
so much for talking to me. You talked to me for my book. You were so nice back then, and
Oh,
I had never met you, found you online. And here you are again. Thank you for helping my audience, and stay safe.
thanks for
How are
having
you
me, Paula.
doing with this pandemic?
It's been an interesting time to deal with a lot of
Mm.
existential fear and that,
Mm.
strangeness of so many clients um, and all of my friends and all of my family and myself all having a similar experience, and
Mm.
people from all those corners processing it with me. I sometimes feel like, yeah, this is this is a this is a deal breaker. This is a make or break moment.
Self-care, right? Because yeah, I've been talking to a lot of colleagues and interviewing for my podcast, and they're they're having to take really good care of themselves. Yeah.
For sure. It's
Well, I'm
important.
sure you are helping a lot of people. Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom and for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you for
Thank
asking me
you.
to chat with you about it, Paula. It's fantastic to have an opportunity to share ideas, colleagues, and
Thank
with
you.
your audience too.
And
I
I
hope
hope
that,
we get to have that happy hour soon, huh?
yes, yes,
Oh my
yes.
God, we've been trying.
Did you have a good trip to Brazil?
I did, yes,
Yes.
yeah, it was fun. And I actually came back beginning of February, and right after that, hell
Yeah.
broke loose. So
Yeah.
I'm glad I came back
Oh,
soon because if I had waited a few more days, I don't think I'll be able to get back here.
mm,
Yeah,
and now you get to be here in the
I
midst of
know.
a pandemic that's like,
Well, but I don't know if you've heard about Brazil.
I have,
We're
you know.
competing. We're competing right now. So there is no better place.
Yeah, but your president, Bolsonaro, has it.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. He did catch it.
Mm.
Anyway, let's not talk about politics. It's too depressing right now.
It really is. It really, really is.
Bye, Tamara. Thank you so
It's
much.
good to see you, Paula. I hope
Thank
you
you.
have the next couple of months go smoothly
Yeah,
for you.
we
And
get to meet. Yeah.
yeah, I would love that.